What is good to you?
I feel like good is a little bit like the difference between, art and obscenity. But it's quite difficult to come up with the perfect collection of words that will nail that. But it's not that hard in practice.
Welcome to Chasing Good, a circle group podcast with the aim to help us better understand the good that's happening in the world today. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy. Hello, and welcome back to Chasing Good. Here with me today, I've got Tom Dawkins. Tom, thank you so much for joining me today, mate.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, mate. Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Now, I would love to start by diving in. I have, looking over your background, you are what I have defined as a lifelong devotee to good. Actually, you've held some, pretty impressive positions, and you've worked in the change and impact space for a very long time, and you've done some really significant, significantly impactful things in the limelight, I suppose, in front. But I imagine that's probably just the tip of the iceberg compared to what you've done in the background too. So I'm really keen to understand. Can we start from the beginning? What got you into the sector? Where did this all start from?
The sector, gosh, I guess it took me a while to even realize there was a sector, I suppose, and an industry built around this stuff. I started kind of doing stuff relatively early. I've always been a bit of a start-upper of things, not always, purpose-driven, but, I set up a local basketball team in my neighborhood because we didn't have one, and recruited the local kids, designed our own uniforms, and published a zine. I was just kind of into doing things. But what really activated me, I guess, around more of a kind of social impact purpose was a series of ridiculously fluky events that resulted in me spending a year in the US during high school on a student exchange. And while there, being invited to attend an event called the State of the World Forum. This is like 1985. So this was this interesting kind of moment in human history, or recent human history, post-Cold War, pre kind of sustainable development goals, when there wasn't really a global language to talk about kind of like big picture objectives. And it's, hard for anyone younger than me to remember. Hard for me to remember, really. I was too young to be paying attention to these things. But for the previous, 50 years, you couldn't talk about anything without talking about the Cold War. You couldn't talk about War and Peace without talking about the Cold War. You couldn't talk about trade and fair trade without talking about the Cold War, and development without talking about the Cold War. Couldn't talk about the environment without talking about the Cold War. It was the universal frame for every conversation that took place at a global level. And then it vanished. And no one kind of knew how to talk about stuff for a little while there. They had to kind of develop a new language to say, well, what are we all oriented around? It was out of all of that. It took years, but out of all of that sort of stuff, it emerged the Millennial Development Goals and then the Sustainable Development Goals on the wall behind me for anyone watching the video. But, I didn't know about any of that sort of stuff. I was having a hard time in high school. I wasn't doing very well. And I discovered there was a thing called a student exchange where you were allowed to GTFO out of your crappy high school and go somewhere else for a while. And I just thought it sounded like the best thing ever. But that was as much push as pull factors. I just felt like, I had a strong instinct that I needed a break from my local high school and everything that was going on. And so I found myself there. And it just so happened that this particular event didn't have, the time, the budget, whatever, to do a genuine global search for worthy young leaders. So they did what you do and what I always tell, startups and change makers to do: partner. Find people who have what you need. And what they needed was young people, diverse young people. And so they partnered with AFS, the world's biggest exchange organization, to get a bunch of young people from 32, 32 of us from 28 different countries around the world to come together as the kind of youth component of this conference. And it was really mind-blowing stuff. Like I met multiple Nobel Peace Prize winners, met Mikhail Gorbachev, had this crazy experience of all these important people asking us what we thought about things and, listening to our points of view. And I think, to me, that's at the heart of empowerment. It's feeling like your story matters, and it's hard to feel that way if no one's willing to listen. And so I came out of that event deeply empowered for the first, really thinking about social, I'd just been thrust into this. And look, I watched the news. My parents are political. We talked about issues around the dinner table. I had a clue. I was paying attention. I cared about this stuff. I just wasn't doing anything yet. I wasn't really contributing. And coming out of that event, I had this kind of these dual sensations. On the one hand, I felt incredibly empowered. Like, oh my God, it's so important to be involved. I've got to do things. Our generation has a role to play. There's all these big issues that need solving. Young people need to be at the front of that. But also I thought, gosh, it's weird that I was there really. Once I calmed down, I'm like, what was I doing there? And it got me thinking about how what I just received was essentially kind of what I just experienced was essentially what youth empowerment looked like, which is to say that it was tokenistic, haphazard, and biased towards wealth. Because while the 32 of us who constituted the youth delegation had this incredible surface diversity, and we were diverse, boys and girls and first world and developing world and, black and white and various other shades. I had this kind of moment of clarity where I realized, but every single one of us had parents who could afford to send us to America for a year on exchange. And it got me thinking about what would it look like and what would it take to give everyone the experience that I had just had, to know that their voice mattered, to have opportunities to meet with other people who cared about the same things as them, and to feel like they had the skills and opportunity to be an active contributor to creating a better future. And that's more or less what I've been trying to do ever since. It's taken a bunch of different forms. I founded a high school student organization. I founded a university student organization. I then founded a nonprofit called VibeWire, which is still around today. It's 24 years old now. I ran that for its first 8 years, which did ran a bunch of programs, and they were all about getting young people more actively involved in being socially entrepreneurial and making things happen. And all of that's ultimately led, but the whole way through, I guess what I am really inspired by is this slightly meta thing of helping other people also find, their sense of purpose and passion, and giving them, building that infrastructure that's about, trying to create those platforms, those opportunities, that culture even, where every voice matters and every person can play a role in creating a better future for all of us. And so, sometimes that's involved opening co-working spaces, sometimes that's involved launching crowdfunding platforms, sometimes that's other types of programs or initiatives, many of which have failed also, by the way, but some of which have hopefully made a small dent on the things I care about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so nice to hear about the failures as well, because it is hard to push through, but then to see you can continue making that impact in different ways, and how does that look? I guess when you're or what does that success look like for you? I suppose, because when we're talking impact means different things for different people. So when you say making that small dent, what does that small dent actually mean?
It's actually a really interesting question that you asked. This is actually a deeper question that may seem on the surface. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about this. How much credit could we ever claim? What's our impact really as a platform? Because there's a counterfactual there. If we didn't exist, would they have just used a different platform to achieve the exact same thing? So it's quite hard to measure if you're genuine about that. You can just add up everything that happened through. One approach to that is this kind of slightly shallow one, which is you just add up and claim everything that happened through the platform. X millions, we've helped people raise X millions of dollars. Thanks to that money, they've affected millions of lives, and just kind of adopt that as your impact. That's the traditional approach with a crowdfunding platform. With the new platform that I'm involved in setting up, LendforGood, which I'm sure we'll talk more about at some point, we wanted to go a bit deeper than that and thought a bit more deeply about that. That we didn't think we could claim that. While certainly we expect there will be many instances where people are raising funds on the platform who wouldn't have otherwise because the opportunities don't exist. It's hard to be definitive about that. Maybe they would have written a grant instead and received that. Maybe they would have gone to a conference and pitched to investors and might have succeeded. So again, same issue. So we define our impact when it comes to LendforGood as changing the shape of the impact investment market. So measuring the people who are making their first impact investment, who are doing this new thing on the lender side, rather than claiming all the impact created on the enterprise side or on the founder side. I mean, obviously we'll try and keep track of that as well. That makes for great stories. But maybe that points to also what it means to me, which is helping people find their pathway towards, creating the impact that they seek. In the case of LendforGood, that's both helping founders access capital they need to grow things that are working and make more impact. But as I said, we kind of measure our impact on helping people discover that impact investing is not only for the mega rich, it can be for all of us through, more decentralized finance and kind of crowd-based approaches. And they're two different examples, but both of them of this deeper thing of people finding a way to contribute. On the one hand, through their entrepreneurial talents and all the blood, sweat, and tears that certainly does go into that. It's absolutely like a hardcore, risky journey to be on. That's why I am so full of eternal love and admiration for the people who step out on that courageous journey. I think particularly when you don't have those who do it without seeking, or in many cases without any possibility of like gigantic wealth, people who set up non-profit structures and then pour their hearts and souls into building them. They don't even have that, that rare but real possibility, purely doing it for the impact. But it's equally important that people, that we have conscious consumers who make the extra effort to purchase from these companies, and that people are willing to lend and invest to them and so on. So yeah, that's what I'm really passionate about, what excites me. And if I could just add, I guess, one thing, I think politics is really important when it comes to social change as well. And while I was at university, I worked more directly in politics. I worked on a couple of elections and for parties. I was a youth organizer. And that's really, I really believe in activism as a way of changing the world as well. But for me, it began to feel frustrating because it was always about trying to convince other people to do the right thing. You had to, like, people had to vote for the right candidates, and then they had to pass the right legislation, and eventually, then the right rules and needed to be built around that legislation. Eventually, we might get there, and that is super important. We can't entrepreneur our way to solve climate change. At some point, you do need to change the rules of the game. But I think that began to feel really frustrating for me. It moves slowly, and it's like a lot of the time you lose, and you fail to convince people to do the thing you want them to do. And what I love about social entrepreneurship, whether that's on the for-profit side or the non-profit side, but just people being entrepreneurial and making things happen and like founding things and launching things, is that they're just getting on with it. And I just love that. I guess that's, I'm that kind of person. I love being surrounded by those other kinds of people who get on with it, who are like, it won't be perfect. We don't have all the resources we need. You never do. What can we do? What can we do with what we've got? How can we try and get some of what else we need? And how can we bring all that together and make progress? As we said, dent this issue, if not solve it. So yeah, that's what lights me up.
And you can see that you've not just let that light you up, but you followed that pathway through StartSomeGood, kind of in that mentor incubator space within the within the social entrepreneurship space. So can we talk a little bit about StartSomeGood and then your journey into LendforGood too? Because that's obviously you've gone from kind of problem solution to problem solution a couple of times throughout that journey, I imagine. So I'm keen to hear about those lessons along the way and what's kind of created the journeys of the businesses there.
It starts some good, but LendforGood.
LendforGood.
I always joke. We have a name. We do have a name. We do definitely have a naming problem in the social enterprise sector. Everything sounds the bloody same. That we're like all of us are just sharing 14 words in slightly different orders. It feels like some of the time. And good and start are two of those 14. So yeah, it gets confusing. So StartSomeGood. So I guess. So to catch up, I kind of after that, I guess that initial experience in the US, I found myself back in America some years later after I left Firewire. I spent 8 years building it. I'd pretty much burnt out. Definitively, I was utterly exhausted. It's a weird thing, as I said, about, a non-profit. For-profits, it's a glamorous experience if you can pass it on to others. It's maybe you get a bunch of money out of that and you can then like chill out for a while. You walk away from a non-profit and you're just unemployed. You don't actually own it, actually. You might have run it or controlled it in various ways, but you don't own it. So one day it's just your last day at work, and the next day you're just an unemployed person who used to run a nonprofit they founded. But I made my way to the US in 2008, really interested to, I guess, kind of somehow like go up a level, I guess, in terms of impact and scope and to see what else was going on. And I ultimately found a job at an organization called Ashoka, who literally coined the phrase social entrepreneurship. Well, the founder of Ashoka, Bill Drayton, did about 50 years ago now. So they weren't, he was describing, he didn't invent the concept, he was describing something he saw, something that was actually happening. But by being the first to describe it, they're the first to really focus on how do we identify these kinds of people, how do we support them, how do we connect them to each other, and so on. And I was the first digital communications director there. And my job essentially was to think about how social media, social technologies could inspire more people to get on this pathway and to be socially entrepreneurial. And so I thought a lot about, and did a lot of great experiments around storytelling and trying to break things. Tell exactly what you were talking about earlier. Tell more stories of failures, not just successes, because there's a tendency with organizations like Ashoka to just endlessly put the people they're giving money to, or in the case of Ashoka, there's an Ashoka Fellowship, is one of the leading kind of fellowships of social entrepreneurs around the world. They all seem absurdly successful. They are, the people like Muhammad Yunus and people who've won Nobel Peace Prizes, and it's kind of hard to be like that could be me. Right from the start. So, it's great but it's great when you actually get to meet someone like Muhammad Yunus, because guess what? They all started humbly, almost always. They all had a bunch of setbacks. They all spent years trying to convince people that what they were doing was worthwhile, But it's only by kind of unearthing more of those early stories, I think, that you help people see themselves or how they too could walk a similar pathway. Anyway, after that, I moved to San Francisco. And so I spent a couple of years working for an innovation for good lab called Hope Lab there and doing some consulting around impact storytelling and so on. But what really struck me about San Francisco, which led me to start Some Good while I was there, was I felt like it was the first time in my life I'd really experienced what a pro-innovation ecosystem looks and feels like. That it really felt like, that I'd been pushing uphill a little bit in the nonprofit social change space. And it was being in San Francisco that gave me language, or again, being able to name things or clarity around why that was. I realized in a way that there's lots of funding for social good, heaps amount of money out there, like in philanthropy, government grants, huge amounts. But essentially it's a world of all VC and no angel funding. Everyone's investing other people's money, through foundation structures, through tax, through government via taxation and so on. So naturally people have a strong tendency to want to get all their investments right. They want them all to succeed. And in order to make, and they need to be able to justify their decisions to others. They need to, they all have some boss that they have to turn around, or someone who provided their funds, the family whose money they're investing or they represent, etc. And they go, this is why we chose these. And that means, that requires data and evidence, and that requires things that have already made a bunch of progress to gather that data and evidence. So that's the mold of a venture capitalist. Try and win the majority of the bets and do, make data-backed decisions that can be justified to the people who gave you the money in the first place. Quite different from how angel invest their money. They don't require, and I realized that in some ways it comes down to these two key questions of San Francisco felt like so the kind of traditional question, the VC question, is, will it work? And that's the philanthropy question traditionally. Will it work? Convince me it will work and I'll fund it. Show me all the data that it works. And, we'd love to fund that. That's great. Whereas in San Francisco, it's all about, could it work? Might not, but could it? Is it at least conceivable? Is it worth trying? What are the odds? Is there at least 101 chance it could make 100x impact? And thinking more in these speculative terms. Now that has its blind sides and downsides and blind spots, I meant to say, and downsides as well. But it was so refreshingly different. And I began to develop this harebrained idea, and there were all these people who were interested in it. I had no evidence it would work, but people thought about, that was cool. And it's just a very enabling, encouraging culture is part of it, but also infrastructure. There's co-working spaces, meetups, accelerator programs, angel investors who, various types of people who are willing to provide various types of support at a could it work stage, not a will it work stage. And essentially that's what I wanted to set StartSomeGood up to do, was to provide similar sorts of infrastructure and support to social entrepreneurs. And in particular, we wanted to focus on that financing piece, those first funds, that kind of angel investment type money to try something, to run a pilot, to do a demo, to do an MVP, to do real things in the real world that allow you to collect evidence, data about what actually happens when you do those things, and then use that data to convince the people who need data. And so we kind of looked around and were really inspired by Kickstarter at the time, particularly. I mean, I was very involved in the Burning Man community at the time. I'd founded a couple of Burning Man camps and, in DC and regional burns and so on. So, crowdfunding really blew up in the Burning Man community, pretty early on, because everyone was always fundraising to pour money into projects, during the festival and so on. And so I kind of light bulb, and then it was, through other artist communities, musician friends, filmmaker friends, and so on. And after a little while, a light bulb went off that this is the same problem, actually, because the problem that Kickstarter was solving for those kind of creative entrepreneurs was that many of them had traditionally relied upon one big yes. If you were a musician, you needed a big yes from a record label. And without that big yes, you weren't going to get into radio stations. You weren't going to get the medium yeses of radio stations playing you in order to get the small yeses of individual listeners deciding they liked what you wanted and being willing to buy albums. Now, not just Kickstarter, but, all of the social technologies allowed those relationships to become direct, creative with audience. And that facilitated, so many more people being able to produce work who wouldn't have otherwise. And I thought that's actually what social entrepreneurs need as well. They need a way to go around these grant makers and these foundations that need that one big yes, for all the money for your project always have to come from one big yes, one rich person, one foundation to fund the whole thing. If instead you could find 100 people, 200 people, 1,000 people to all chip in, what they personally can accept, then you can progress. And from a risk point of view, it becomes a lot easier to be one of a hundred to provide 1% of a project budget or 1,000th of a percent of a project budget than having to fund the whole thing. Part of the risk aversion is expecting that any one big yes will fund this entirely unproven experiment. That is just, they're not the right audience for that. But actually, people are hungry for that because those kind of riskier early bets are also exciting, innovative. They often, they're often a personal story of passion and commitment to make a difference. And people love being part of those stories. And so we started with StartSomeGood. Sorry, I know I'm going on too long, and I'll try and speed up to the Lend4Good.
Please continue.
But essentially, we kept trying to solve the adjacent problem. And I would say this has been a learning of mine, and it's like a warning. This is a bad tendency of mine, is I try to do too much, and I then move on to the next thing. I'm not disciplined about kind of knuckling down and building thing I'm doing. I kind of see them, another light bulb goes off, and I get excited about that. And in some ways, we followed this pathway moving earlier. So we started at the first funds, but coming back to our impact and thinking about, how you make impacts, we weren't the first crowdfunding platform. We're one of the first that was explicitly and exclusively focused on social impact. But what did that mean? Many of those projects could have still talked about, got used in, Indiegogo or Kickstarter. So what made us different? And crowdfunding is a really powerful way to introduce an idea and build a community and to raise funds. But it's just a tool set at the end of the day. It's a set of tools. And so I know that you don't empower people just by giving them the tools. You have to teach them how to use the tools. When we did kind of, youth engagement and work and so on with Vibo, we wouldn't just drop a bunch of cameras off at a community center and keep moving. We'd run a program teaching the young people how to make films and then leave them with the cameras. You need both. And so that was the approach we took to crowdfunding as well, which is that our real impact was teaching people how to crowdfund. Now, what I didn't realize at the time was that totally breaks the crowdfunding business model. I did not know what I was doing. I was exploring, I guess, this intersection point of business models and impact. I was really excited about social enterprise that I'd heard a bit about, and it seemed like a great alternative to write into pitching to rich people and writing grant applications all the time, which I'd spent a lot of time doing. With Vibewire, a huge chunk of my job was fundraising, and I thought this is better. I hadn't really thought through. I didn't have the right mentors. I didn't have access to a good course that would really help me think through how those two things meet. If our business model was crowdfunding, that's a platform business model, which essentially requires high volume, low touch to work. Because you're only taking a few percentage usually of the funds flowing through the platform. So you need millions and millions of dollars, but you can't then spend heaps of money on, time and effort on a per project basis. But if our impact model is capacity building, that's almost definitionally high touch, low volume, depending on how you do it. It's, if you're taking on if you want to work with people who require more than average capacity build, people who haven't done this before, people who don't look like traditional founders, people with a lived experience of disadvantage, which are the kinds of people we're very passionate about facilitating their ideas and helping them solve, social challenges they themselves have experienced. So it took me years to figure out what was wrong here. Why are we working so hard and making nowhere near enough money to justify all the effort we're putting in? And it was just this fundamental mismatch between those two core elements of social enterprise, the impact model and the business model. It took a little while to figure it out though. And eventually we figured out that there were other people who might pay us to build the capacity of that community. Ironically, that got us back somewhat into a philanthropic space, but now pitching to foundations as customers, essentially. We can help solve problems, you have, and also corporates as CSR and cause marketing. But none of that's so very different. So I did actually find myself, ironically, within a few years back doing something not so dissimilar to what I'd done before, lots of pitches, lots of proposals. But it was worth it because it meant that we were able to work with people who wouldn't have been able to pay their own way, at least not, for the help they themselves needed. And so that caused us to build over time a number of different programs with our partners, sometimes branded by them and so on. So we discovered that in addition to the crowdfunding platform, we now had kind of these structured, kind of programs that help people think through what they wanted to launch. Eventually we thought, well, maybe we should just make that publicly available as well. And so we launched our Good Hustle program about 4 or 5 years ago, which is a 10-week social enterprise design program. We also began to feel like, part of the shortcoming or the limitation, I guess, of a crowdfunding platform as a capacity building vehicle is that people only arrive when they already think they're launch ready. And the truth is sometimes they're not, often they're not. Sometimes that's just a matter of tweaking things, helping them clarify who the target market and their pitch is. But sometimes it would have been beneficial to meet them at an earlier stage when they're still actually thinking about the thing and designing things, just like me and my crowdfunding platform. I needed to no one could have saved me 2 weeks out from when I was pitching it or launching it. I needed at an earlier stage to realize there was a mismatch between these two fundamental pillars. And so, we've been doing that for the last 5 years. And these days, that sort of thing is the majority of what we do is capacity is kind of programs, either individually, but primarily small group programs, which I really believe in. I think they're the sweet spot of like personal attention, but also, feeling like you're part of something, and that helps sustain you on the journey. That's really important as well. Then, people coming out of those programs didn't want to like lose the thread of what was going on. So then particularly during COVID, we got a lot of feedback that people desperately wanted to like access each other, connect with each other founders going through it, access new thinking, but no one wanted to do a course right now. No one wanted to do a program. It like wasn't the time like to commit to that sort of thing. So we launched our community that we call the StartSomeGood network. And so that's an ongoing, people get invited to 3 to 4 events every month, fireside chats, mastermind groups, workshops, and so on. But through all of this, there was this kind of systemic frustration we began to see more and more, which is we help people get started. We were moving earlier stage, from the moment of launch to like down to design and ideation. But what about the next stage after that, growth? There's still an incredible lack of opportunity and funding at that stage. That began to kind of feel more and more frustrating, that we were helping so many people get started, but so many of them are getting that. They often survive because they're very passionate, driven people, and because they're doing something that works and the world needs and people are willing to pay for. But they get stuck because there's often very hard to access modest amounts of capital to invest in the business to grow, whether that's in kind of replication or machinery or new markets or improved packaging. There's heaps of money in impact investing, but part of my frustrating is it's replicated that exact same dynamic as philanthropy. It's all will it work money, and there's no could it work money in impact investing. It's all sitting inside these giant impact investment funds. And just because of the economics of the fund, I used to think this was all about risk, actually. It's mostly not. It's mostly just the economics of funds. They can't do deals of less than the millions because of the way in which they do deal sourcing and due diligence. It's so expensive and laborious, and they all need financial industry salaries, that the per deal costs are so high that they can't do them below a certain point. So that creates this gap where we've got a lot of energy at the very beginning, some great, not just StartSomeGood, like a bunch of good supporters and intermediary working hard around that starting stage. Then we've got huge amounts of money, $1.2 trillion last year invested in impact investment. But the hidden truth, the dark secret of the industry right now is that it's invested in impact investing. Most of it wasn't invested in impact because it's stuck inside these funds that are having trouble finding enough enterprises that meet their requirements in terms of the amount of evidence they need, the amount of traction they need, how far they need to go to in order to be ready to receive $1 million at a time, $10 million at a time, $100 million, which is what they all want to invest in. The bigger, the better, because it's more efficient for them. And we think that's because there's this gap here, that it's hard to be ready. It's hard to get to the point where you're ready for $1 million investment if someone hasn't invested $100,000 or $200,000 at that earlier stage. And there's almost no one willing even to think about that in impact investing right now, which is what ultimately got us talking with our friends at Red Hat Impact, who themselves are kind of helping people do small scale loans through this space. So they were kind of doing everything that was needed. They were finding great enterprises and helping them think through what they needed on the one hand. They were building a community of people willing to participate in these loans. They didn't have a fund themselves. They were just the matchmaker, but it was all done through an email list, essentially. So about 5 years ago, we got talking. I'm like, you need a platform for that. The only way that's great. I love what you're doing, but you're just one. If it's just you, you're going to do 20 deals a year. That's going to be nice, but it doesn't even begin to it doesn't even dent. It's not even noticeable on the scale of the need and the opportunity. And so it took us a long time. We, had a lot of stop starts, but we spent a little over 4 years working together to figure out how to kind of combine their lending with our knowledge of platform dynamics and crowdfunding, figuring out how that would work from a regulatory point of view, what technology you use and so on. But that's how we came to do LendforGood. LendforGood's a separate startup, co-founded by the teams, but standing on its own with a different model. And it is determined to be a pure platform and to learn from I don't see them as mistakes because it's kind of the path we want to walk, but, to learn from, our experience with StartSomeGood, that you can't be both the platform and the capacity builder, not at least without two very different, robust business model setups. So LendforGood's the platform. And then we partner with people like Red Hat and others like them who are doing the work of identifying great opportunities and worthwhile enterprises and helping them think through their capital needs, building their capacity, doing the due diligence, and then they list them on our platform. So LendforGood is quite a unique model that is, from a user perspective, looks like other crowdfunding platforms. You get that portfolio of different deals happening. Only one or two at a time at the moment, to be honest, because we're still in the proof of concept phase, but we're about to really open that up and increase that. But each of those deals has actually been vetted by a third party expert and has their endorsement in order to get on the platform. And so we're hoping to kind of provide this unique combination of choice and confidence, which is quite hard to find in early stage investing, and particularly in impact investing.
It's such a interesting correlation. So I actually caught up, I had a chat with a gentleman who runs a impact investing fund at the higher commercial level. So I was really interested to talk to you as well around how we see that, because I know that you kind of specialize more in the grassroots space and kind of bridging that gap, which is, as we say, a very significant gap.
Mm-hmm.
So it was fascinating how that's happening, and awesome that you're creating that solution. Like what an incredible thing, and I truly hope that you're being given all of the support, and you're getting the tailwinds to support you on this venture, because it's such an important thing. We need more. All boats rise when the tide comes in. So
Yeah,
and it is
absolutely.
an important piece of the puzzle. So power
It
to you,
is.
mate. That's fantastic.
It's a tricky dynamic. It's funny in a way with trying to get this off the ground. It has been, I mean, it's always hard to raise money. We are right. The irony is we're right in that spot ourselves. The reason we're trying to build this is because there's this capital gap. But guess what? We need that kind of amount of capital at that early stage, post proof of concept. Some runs on the board, but still early, still risky for sure, to try and get where we're going. So in some ways, we're trying to, prove ourselves wrong in terms of the ability to raise capital at this point, in order to build a platform that will make it much easier for people to fill that. At the same time, a big part of our hypothesis around how is it you get more of that risk tolerant early stage capital and so on is that it's got to be more connected to the stuff people really care about, people's passions. And I think part of where the impact investment market is a little bit stuck is that they're focused on trying to convince people to make impact investing one of their passions. So they're constantly trying to sell impact investing as a concept. But it's so conceptual. Most people don't resonate with concepts ever at all. That's not what people like. That's not actually what lights people up. Now I do. I'm really, as I've been talking about, I'm really into this kind of these infrastructure platforms. But I also know that's not how most people actually operate or think, and it's not how you raise money in general. When we teach people to crowdfund, the main thing we're helping them focus on is to get more focused, is to get more specific, identify very specific groups of people who care about very specific things that are relevant for your project, and then hone in on them. And that's kind of what we're saying here as well, that at the moment, in order to do impact investing, you have to be willing normally to put large amounts of money into a relatively unfocused fund. Now, there are increasing numbers of kind of thematic funds, an oceans fund and affordable housing funds, but most impact investing funds are still just impact investing funds. And people don't, it's a little bit like if the way to give to charity was you had to give money to Charity Australia, and then they distributed it into whatever they thought was most valuable. How many people would give money to charity? Some still would, because some people just believe in philanthropy, just like some people believe in impact investing. They just have a commitment to be philanthropic, and they're going to be philanthropic, and they're going to work with that. But most people don't have a commitment to be philanthropic and don't care about philanthropy. They care about supporting refugees. They care about getting plastic out of the oceans. They care about adapting to climate change. They care about making sure every child has a fair start in life, or whatever it is that they care most about. And I think part of where we're stuck with impact investing is we're trying to put impact investing on that list alongside those things. And we think that that's not required. It's enough that they care about those things. Give them the opportunity to contribute to those things through investment. But you only get down to that once it gets specific, once it's deal by deal. And that's where we're trying to kind of bring this together. But again, we're trapped in this paradox where we know that's what works. That's what we teach everyone else to do. But when it comes to me pitching LendforGood, it's impossible not to pitch it as this like broadly based platform and end up talking about what I did talk to you a bit about, which is about this systemic capital gap in the industry, which is like stuck in process. And so anyway, I'm still figuring this out, to be honest, how to like weave all those things together properly. It's an interesting experience of constantly being trapped. It feels like doing the opposite of what I know is best practice and what I teach everyone else to do.
Mate, everything that you have said has struck a chord on a very, very deep level. I can't even explain. But I am curious to understand, I guess, we're talking the frameworks, and we're talking I suppose the technicalities of building a social enterprise, which is obviously a point of passion for yourself. And and we touched on earlier, it's underpinned from a place of, inspiration, I suppose, from your younger years. I'm really keen to understand what it's meant for you now, as you've kind of developed into yourself, not just as a business person, but as a human being, and how it feels to do what you're doing, and to live this life.
That is so interesting, Mike. That's a great question, but it's actually quite challenging to answer because it's so hard. I find it really hard to visualize another type of life. I feel like there's definitely been times over the last, 12 years of doing StartSomeGood and being a social entrepreneur where my wife might have vaguely floated, imagine if you'd gone into the corporate world, you could, and so I try to imagine that, and it's easy enough to imagine what it would feel like to have twice the salary or whatever. I can but I can't actually, but then I try to imagine myself like going into one of those office towers every day and, following heaps of very specific procedures, and maybe been frustrated with the ethics or approach of the company, but maybe having very limited ability to affect that. And I'm kind of like, I don't know, like it's just that it feels like that was never for me in a way. And that's part, I guess, of having, you said at the start, and it's true, but I have been a lifer with this stuff. And it's been a great privilege, to be able to really pursue my passions. I mean, I never had a great plan, to be honest, as kind of my story has probably shown. Like there's a bunch of other things I've tried to do that we didn't touch. I tried to launch a Giving Circle app that failed. I tried to, heaps of different things through the years. But I guess, a couple of them popped. I didn't know in advance which of them would or did, but, and not popped to some crazy extent, I'm not, I'm not like some tech billionaire or anything, but to the extent that I was able to make it my living. And I just think that's been an enormous joy and a privilege, even if there are some sacrifice along the way. But it doesn't feel like sacrifice, because it just feels like, a very fulfilling life that's been filled with the things that I want it to be filled with. And it's interesting also, I was diagnosed only quite recently with ADHD after my kids were. And turns out ADHD is quite genetically correlated. So generally, if your kids have it, it came through one of the parents. And my wife, Kate, did not have a moment's doubt where it had come from between us. So she instantly diagnosed me with it away. And in some ways that was nice, because I feel like she became slightly more, gave her, maybe more empathy around some things, like a certain level of time blindness that, that she's always found a little bit frustrating about living with me. And eventually I thought I should actually go talk to them. Maybe I shouldn't just take my wife's word for it, who doesn't really know what she's talking about, and go see someone. And sure enough, I was prescribed. But it was interesting because there's no blood test or anything for that. It's mostly a survey. And so they ask you all these questions about your life, and they say things like, do you lose your things? And I'm like, no, because I always put them in the same place. Otherwise, yeah, I would have no idea where anything was, and do you forget what you have on? I'm like, no, because I look at my calendar every 30 minutes or so, because I have no idea what I have on, but I obsessively check, and I put everything in my calendar. And in some ways I realized that I had built a life in some ways, that part of the privilege of, I guess, pursuing my passions and starting things and building my own businesses, while it's certainly, I feel like maybe I wouldn't be so grey were it not for all of that, and whatever else might be different, has allowed me to build a life both very focused on passion, but also kind of designed around my own foibles and how I like to work. And so it was weird because getting this diagnosis didn't change much for me, to be honest. But I met other people at the same age for whom this has been life changing. They spent their whole life, and they're people always who are in the corporate world. They spent their whole life trying to fit their dodecahedron shaped brain into some square hole to fit with the corporate life, and now they've finally been diagnosed, and now they finally know what's going on, and now they can kind of focus on building practices, and now maybe they're medicated and things are easier, and they're like, oh my god, where was this 20 years ago? And I don't feel like that in a way, because I think in some ways it pushed me towards this. I'm not sure, but I've also I've been fired a bunch. I reckon I've been fired more times than anyone else I know. Normally when I tried to do something that didn't align with my passions, I think fundamentally, and this might be connected to my ADHD, my story was always I'm a fundamentally very lazy person, but very passionate. And so I have to do work that's linked to my passions. I don't have a good work ethic, just as a baseline. I see with my wife Kay, I've seen her do some jobs that she didn't love, but she did a great job. She's got a great work ethic. She's a very, she's a very honorable person, very good person. I look at that and go, and I know that I don't have that good work ethic. Anytime I've had a job that didn't really light me up, I've A, started something on the side, and then B, got fired, normally in that order. As I became even worse at the job, as I got sucked into my side hustle that actually did resonate with my passions, and took longer and longer lunch breaks and arrived later and later while I was literally running on the side. I mean, I've gone through that cycle several times. So I don't know. It's hard to kind of imagine. I just think in some ways I was never built for anything else, and I'm very lucky that I found something at an early age that I was passionate about. I think I only touched on it, but I was really struggling midway through high school because I didn't know where I wanted to go, and I didn't just have that I should work hard because you should work hard kind of vibe. My parents and teachers were telling me I should work hard. In some ways, my reaction was like, don't tell me what to do. Screw you guys. And so I could imagine how it might have gone wrong if I'd gone all the way through high school and still had no idea not found something that I was really passionate or interested about. I mean, maybe I probably would have still gone to university, to be honest. That was my family culture, but I would have floated through my arts degree and I don't know, come out of that, and I don't know, who knows? But yeah, so it feels good though. I think that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but it feels important for me that I get up and every day I'm working on behalf of things I care about. I've been able to build a life where I feel very fairly compensated within my social enterprises for the work that I do. And I'm really grateful and thrilled that this gets to be my day job and not something I have to forever do on the side at the risk of getting fired, of making some other boss super pissed off at me.
All part of the journey, though, hey, and it's,
Yeah,
and you
sure
tie
is.
back to that impact that you were talking to before, saying, oh, well, if it weren't for us, would they have found means elsewhere, or would we have? I like to think there's a balance in between the two, because it's it's never just the funding. You never know where people are taking inspiration from and how they're going. Just the very nature of you having that business in existence would probably inspire people more than you realize too. So there's a lot to be said for the whole action of the lifestyle that you live beyond that of just the actions that you take in a day-to-day piece.
Yeah. And I hope that it provides. I think part of the thing that so I know we need to wrap up, but just I'm proud that I think it provides a certain example to my kids as well, because I truly believe part of why I'm on this journey is because that's what I saw from my parents. They weren't entrepreneurs. They weren't what we'd call social entrepreneurs. They're both public servants. My dad was a town planner, and my mum worked for the ABC, so public broadcasting. But they both really deeply believed in the meaning and purpose of the work. My mum really deeply believes, and still does, in the importance of a public broadcaster in a democracy, and showcasing unheard voices. And she did some really pioneering work around Indigenous broadcasting and feminist broadcasting. My dad really believes in and cares deeply about the role of town planning in designing spaces and what happens where and how communities come together. And so I think I was very fortunate that I had these examples of that. I just grew up with a framework that work is a place where you pursue your passions and meaning, and make a difference in the world. Now, up until I found something that was confusing because it didn't seem to line up, none of the jobs I knew existed kind of resonated with me in that way, but I kind of knew that's what I was looking for. Mine hasn't been as structured as them. My dad got a town planning degree and then became a town planner, so it's been a little bit more haphazard, but no regrets whatsoever. Couldn't be. So, yeah.
This is a nice segue for me, because I find the conversation of children, the consideration of children, even I've got a kid on the way myself, and I thank you, and I think the concept of of good and how you live and how you and the things that you do in the moments for yourself but for them, and how you're trying to impart knowledge and wisdom and kindness and generosity and a work ethic and inspiration into the children you live with is such a fascinating journey to go on. For yourself, has that changed how you act in moments, how you act in days?
I think it's got me, to be honest. I think, parenthood is delightful and awful in lots of different ways, often at the same time. From a kind of work social change point of view, it's probably pushed my thinking out further in a way that I find deeply uncomfortable at times, because if you're paying attention and then you follow the trends forward, there's some pretty bleak outcomes that are well within the range of possibility. And it's funny, for all that I'm very future focused in my work and social change focused, I've never been someone who looks all that far ahead. I would never call myself a futurist. I'm quite like of the moment. As I kind of said, what I admire is that kind of entrepreneurial spirit of what have we got? What do we need to do now? What have we got to do it? Let's do the best we can. Learn from it. Do better next time. And so I've never been someone that, never in my life have I had a plan that was further than kind of a year ahead. Most of the time, I've often not done anywhere. Like when I moved to America, I hadn't done anywhere near enough planning or reading just about what is involved in getting a visa. Even I just thought, I'll figure it out, and I did. So that's kind of worked for me, but that doesn't work as with being a parent as much. I mean, just in practical ways, we almost missed enrolling him to do the selective high school exam last year, because if we hadn't noticed it at 10 p.m. on a Sunday, it was that midnight was the cutoff. He just wouldn't be sitting that exam. Just because I was not thinking about high school. People keep asking things like what high school they're going to. I mean, it's relevant now. My eldest is in year 6. Now I'm ready to engage. But people asked me that question when he was in year 1 or something. I was like, I don't know what country we'll be in, let alone what high school he'll go to. And from a social change point of view, looking ahead 10 years, 20 years, as you start doing, you think about, the possible trend lines with democracy, inequality, AI, possibilities, climate, all of that gets a bit scary at times, actually. I went to this conference a few years ago. It was for very high level social change leaders, like CEOs of lots of famous Greenpeace and the trade union movements, ACOS, and some politicians were all off the record. My friend was involved in organising. I was like, can I come? So I got to be a volunteer. So I was assigned, and I had to help facilitate. And it broke into these half-day kind of future-oriented sessions looking 20 years ahead into all these issue verticals. And I got assigned the one about the future of work, and I had the head of the trade union movement. Anyway, I think I said it was all off the record, but none of this is that out there. They've all talked about it, and this was a while ago anyway. But I came out of that just convinced that my kids would never have a job. I was quite thrown by going really deep into this very specific issue that I didn't know very much about. And I'm like, oh my goodness, So I think that's one of the ways in which those are both two versions of the same thing, both in practical ways, having to kind of get a bit more planned for our family's life a little bit ahead is hard for me. And from a social change point of view, not just thinking about, what can we do now? Let's make things better. But where are things going decades in the future is quite bracing. I mean, I've kept pulling that thread, and I'm interested. I've been exploring it. I've been reading lots of books about it. But yeah, it's good. You got to kind of manage your emotions and energies as well, I think, when you're engaging in some of this kind of scary future stuff. And that's why I balance it by getting to hang out with entrepreneurs through programs who are getting on with it again. So I feel very lucky because, again, I worry that if I was still in that activist space, I feel like it'd be hard not to get really emotionally burnt out. I mean, I know scientists really suffer from this, people who spent decades sharing the truth of what's happening with climate, and people just won't listen or do anything about it. It just drives you crazy. So yeah, that's been a big shift.
Yeah, amazing. I think you've also highlighted a lot of the I suppose frustrations, or not even frustrations, the challenges that come with that accompany democracy, with such change, but balancing the long term with the short term needs.
Yeah, it's kind of like businesses. I feel they're both democracy is the best worst system. It was the same political science in terms of there's a million things wrong with it. It's easy to point to all its flaws. It's just that no one's come up with anything better. I kind of feel in some ways capitalism is kind of like that. Nothing's better. There's heaps wrong with it. I get it. But kind of that's where I'm at. And I was maybe more radical once in my youth. But there's no better system. So much as with democracy, you got to tactically improve it over time. And same with building a better kind of form of capitalism that we hope just kind of centralizes this future. I mean, I think it's better for the business. It eventually will come to, I think, a point where I hope that most of us will agree that actually what's best for the future of the world is also what's best for the future of the economy, and we can kind of all get on board. And that's why I think now is such an amazing moment, dare I say it, in starting kind of a social enterprise, because I do think you can really see we're on the cusp of something, that there's a few big picture status quo forces that are holding things back. And it is a matter, but I genuinely believe, and if anyone listening agrees, that it's a matter of when, not if, that we make some bigger picture changes in terms of putting a price on carbon and, true cost economics and pricing and externalities. Then essentially what social entrepreneurs are doing is building those businesses now ready for that future. Because social entrepreneurs already factor that stuff in. We're not forced to, by legislation, but by conscious, and not everyone does it equally well across all the different things you can choose to care about and measure. But, but what any type of purpose-driven business or social enterprise ultimately represents is a willingness to care about those two things equally, and therefore to actually think about what are those downstream, what are the negative externalities, positive externalities, how to reduce the former and increase the latter. So when that big switch does happen, and I think it is just a matter of time, and suddenly like which has to happen at pricing, as taxation, instead of taxing jobs, we tax pollution and things like that, just obvious shifts that I think will happen. Then I think those are going to be the giant companies of the future. Whether someone's going to, you look at these sustainable development goals, and these are business challenges. Zero hunger, it's businesses that are going to be making those food. Clean energy for everyone, businesses will make that energy. And so there's some big changes coming, and I think sometimes being too early is the same as being too late. But for those who nail the timing on creating the enterprises that are ready for that, and then we get the political will to also make those shifts, there'll be some really heroic companies built, I think.
I absolutely love those insights too. That's amazing. Thank you for that perspective. That was really nice and very well articulated too. What is good to you?
Oh gosh, these are deceptively giant questions you ask. I mean, it is hard. I feel like good is a little bit like the difference between art and obscenity, but it's quite difficult to come up with the perfect collection of words that will nail that. But it's not that hard in practice. So one of the interesting challenges of launching StartSomeGood is we didn't care about the tax status of a given entity. We didn't care if you're for-profit or non-profit or your legal structure. We only cared about what you were doing and whether, it was good. Were you starting some good? But it did mean, there's a reason that most kind of social good fundraising platforms are only for non-profits and so on, is because you don't have to ask that question. You say, what's good is a non-profit structure. Now, that's not true, of course. There are non-profits who do all sorts of stuff that you and I would not agree is good. And so we actually wanted to think about that. In practice, it wasn't that hard to do. Again, it's hard to describe the line for you, but just on a day-to-day basis of like managing a crowdfunding platform and looking at projects, you can generally tell. And part of what we would look for, I guess, is it has to have benefits beyond the person initiating the fundraiser. So one of the things we didn't do was personal. There's a type of crowdfunding you see on certain platforms, which is either maybe I need a new liver and I'm going to raise money for it, or I have a chance to go to university, I'm going to raise money for it. Nothing wrong with those per se. We just don't do them. So we don't consider that to be social change. There has to be kind of a goal to make impacts more directly. I mean, people say, but then I can go to medical school, I can get back to my community. That's all a bit like long-term and uncertain for us. So we look for projects that, do good beyond the initiator. We wouldn't take any projects that we believe kind of increased disharmony or so we wouldn't, and kind of vilified another group. So we wouldn't take many political campaigns. We wouldn't take political campaigns either, PS, like actual like campaigning, in informal elections. And so there are a few, we didn't do things that were primarily about proselytizing, even if there were other social welfare benefits tied up with those. There are a few places where we, the kind of, as I said, it was pretty easy, case by case. Probably the trickiest things were, stuff that was motivated by religion rather than for the growth of a religious organization. It's fine to be motivated by your own personal beliefs, and that's why you're doing this work, but it can't be primarily missionary work. That was our line. We would sometimes laugh, though, that we should have had a sister platform called StartSomeGood, because we would get quite a lot of those. And I would also constantly mistype the URL and end up on StartSomeGood. So at the very least, we should have it as a redirect. Who else is doing this? The other place was arts, because on the one hand, all art is good. And so I'm an artist and I want to get my art out there in the world. Don't you believe in art? And yeah, I do believe in art. But again, that's kind of where we come to, does it, is there a benefit for a group beyond you? And not just your listeners, your people's enjoyment of your art or your advancement as an artist in the arts world. But there has to be kind of just another element. Now sometimes that was achieved through a give back. We're releasing an album, but 50% of profits we're giving to these causes to, buy instruments for kids who can't afford them. Sometimes it was about, we're releasing an album of music from, the South Sudanese community in Australia, who otherwise are, don't have much access to sharing their culture, nor other people to hear it. There's some sort of community aspect like that, we would take it. So those were the two places where sometimes we'd have a conversation or a debate, but generally it didn't even require that. It was pretty easy to be like, that's clearly socially driven. That's what they're talking about and what they're here for. Now, whether it was a good idea is not what we judged, not at least for StartSomeGood. We figured that's the whole crowdfunding mechanism. That's the kind of wisdom of that, you have to convince some community that they believe it's good. So we were overtly not judging, is this a good way to create impact? Is this a good way to create good? We were only looking at the second. Is this an attempt? Does this feel to us like a genuine attempt to do good? And then it's up to you guys to decide if you think it's actually worth doing or worth attempting. Because who are we to say? If it's doing some after-school care program in the Kimberley, we don't know that community. We can't decide if that's the right thing that they need. So that's in some ways linking back to democracy and kind of why I am passionate about crowdfunding and why I want to launch it was because it allows communities to, I think, figure that out for themselves on some level, to decide if they want to see it happen. Every community has resources. They're just hard to share often, and crowdfunding allows them to come together.
It's interesting. When I asked the question, what is good, you referred straight back to the business of what is of the frameworks that
that's true.
You
the
followed
mechanics,
from a commercial, from a frameworks perspective. I suppose that makes me wonder or curious around if that's been if those same frameworks have impacted your personal life or the personal decision-making processes that you followed when you consider what is good, when you consider how to behave in certain situations, how to react, how to respond.
Probably subtly in lots of ways, to be honest. But certainly I'm not very good actually, even like, pros, cons lists or even basic things. It's funny. I don't apply. I'm not as structured, I guess, in my thinking processes. But I guess that's the interesting thing about building organizations and not just being, some random guy, is that you do actually need to build structures that can be adopted by others. You need to kind of get agreement. They need to be intuitive and manageable, or else you can never hand anything over and never make an impact bigger than yourself. And so I think it has been an interesting process. And as I said, I'm kind of unusually interested in the kind of, I did a philosophy degree, so I'm kind of interested in the structure of argument and, how we debate, the different ways in which we think and the frames we use as much as about the content. And that's why I think I've always been kind of drawn to these fairly meta, how do we empower more young people to be active participants in democracy? What does a better democracy look like? How do we build a more social capitalism? How do we increase them in the StartSomeGood school? How do we increase the pace of innovation for good? I find myself often at that level. And I think that's just what I'm drawn to. I think, like within the health industry, everyone would probably agree that what's good is healthy people. But in terms of actually how you interact with that and contribute to that, some people feel the need to be a GP and want to be one-on-one. It's all about that contact with other people. Others want to be surgeons and they don't actually interact with people per se. They never get to know them, but they get in there and do a complicated specialty and are very well compensated. Others want to be hospital administrators. They love making the systems, work in a group of people, function at a high level. And some want to be in policy or politics and, design the system and make it better. You need people at all of those levels. But I guess I'm just drawn to that top level, which is hard because I don't want to go into politics and things like that. Normally that also involves having to work in highly structured environments. So I guess that's, again, I've found myself at entrepreneurship and innovation at the early stage, because you can design for those big picture changes and you can think about where you're trying to get to. LendforGood is really trying to change the shape of impact investing in Australia by being the first retail impact investment platform, making this big new opportunity available to a whole huge new group of people. And in so doing, we hope really drive that innovation we need. But we can also start small, and that's where I think there's such interesting entrepreneurial opportunities today in a fast moving world to kind of, for those of us who are drawn to systems change, to really think about how we can pursue that even in a very lean way. But for others, it's about that's why I think sometimes there's too much obsession with scale in the social enterprise sector. There's a lot of stuff that is just appropriate size. Someone just wants to run a social enterprise cafe in their local town. That's awesome. That's really fantastic for them too. So I guess what's good for me is that people find that way to contribute, and that we can all. I hope that we can all find a way, and I hope that we all feel. And I know that we don't all feel this, but I would love to live in a world where everyone feels like they have a role to play and are respected as a member of the community. It's why I focus so much on youth stuff when I was younger. I really thought that was a uniquely youth problem. Young people were unique. That was just probably my angst. I felt uniquely underheard and under-respected by adults. But I thought the systemic issue essentially was young people not being involved and respected. And as I've got older. And maybe this is convenient as a non-young person. I've come to believe it's even more deeply systemic than that. It's not, there's like I think if you just went out on the street, most people would feel like they're not really maybe part of it. And I think that unfortunately that gap is growing in terms of people feeling represented by leaders and organizations, institutions, politicians, companies, any of them. So yeah, trust in society is a big challenge. Anyway, I'm going all over the place now in answer to your question. What's good is hanging out with other change makers like you, Mike, and getting to talk about this stuff. This is good. This is what I've always loved. I've got to get on with it as well. But I would say, someone who loved a philosophy tutorial. This is a lot of fun. And again, that I get to do this for work, have great long chats with people like you to share these ideas with listeners who are hopefully interested is kind of amazing to me. This is good.
Most certainly. And look, and that is a very nice, again, segue into to the conclusion of our conversation here today, Tom. That is all we have time for, mate. But look, I really, truly appreciate you taking the time and sharing your story and your wisdom and your philosophies and your frameworks that have helped you on your journey so far. And thank you for all that you have done and all that you do and all that you will do. I look forward to continuing to follow the journey, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the lessons they've learned today from the conversation too.
Absolutely. And if I could do a final plug, if anyone wanted to take those lessons and kind of take a big step themselves into pursuing an entrepreneurial idea, would love you to come and connect with us at StartSomeGood.com. And if you're already running a business with a strong impact model and need to grow, you should check out LendforGood. Or, of course, if you want to contribute to those businesses growing, you would like to take a little step into impact investing, we would love you to check that out as well. So, hope to connect with many listeners through one platform or another as we all continue this journey of doing the best we can, really, with what we've got.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, mate.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Chasing Good, a Circle Group podcast. Our mission is to shift the world closer to kindness, sustainability, awareness, and action. We hope you enjoyed. Until next time.